Liberia! Ha! It's your day! It's time to party! This is real fame! Doing it for y'all! I am proud to be a Liberian, and I don't care what anybody go say. I will jump and sing and shout hooray, 'cause today is our Independence Day. Liberia, oh our day. Liberia, we are free. Liberia, no more war. Liberia, Liberia, our day. Liberia, we are free. 'Cause today is our day.
I hear the cry of the Pepperbird, a familiar sound of my home, a sound that means the promise of freedom to me. My home is Liberia, named for liberty, after the promise taken by free descendants of slaves from America who came here to create a country of their own. The civil unrest has been a part of my life for so long that the thought of peace as more than a dream was foreign to me. As a student in America, I was able to see how deeply conflict is rooted in the history of my people and this land. I want to tell a story of Liberia. Will you listen for a while? It's rather ironic where this story begins. In 1607, Europeans came to America. As subjects of British law, they brought with them the European concept of indentured servitude, a euphemism for temporary slavery. Anyway, these indentured servants were white people who had their passage paid in exchange for 7 years of servitude. After that, they were set free and given a plot of land, money, and seeds to begin a life of their own. It wasn't until 1619 that the first Africans arrived in America when a Dutch ship docked in Jamestown, Virginia. The Africans, who were actually the ship's cargo, were traded for food and placed under the same stipulations as other indentured servants, that they would gain their freedom in 7 years. However, continually buying and trading African slaves was expensive and cut into profits from the tobacco crop. So it wasn't long before the colonists decided to model their slave codes after those in the Caribbean that mandated perpetual servitude. Not only were the Africans slaves for their entire lives, but so were their children and every generation born thereafter. Some people focus on slavery as if it first began at that time and in America. In reality, slavery has been part of many cultures and places, including African custom, for as long as anyone can remember. Tribes would conquer other tribes and use the conquered as their own slave or sell them at the slave markets. This was a common practice throughout the history of my people. But the institution of slavery in America was different. The issue of freedom drives much human behavior, and it's ironic that as the population of black slaves in America grew, the American colonists began their own fight for freedom from Britain. This was, of course, known as the American Revolution. In the midst of this battle for release from English rule, the idea of self-government took form. Something radical and revolutionary was created as a result. The Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men.
The colonists wanted to start over with a blank slate, a tabula rasa, as if starting over were really part of the human experience. They wanted self-rule and attempted to create a level of equality that had previously only existed in theory. In 1781, with the defeat of the British at Yorktown, America became a free and independent nation, proclaiming liberty throughout the land. Now, how in good conscience could these champions of freedom talk of such a thing when they were slaveholders themselves? It's as if they were blind to their own hypocrisy. The very men who fought for freedom were dependent on slaves, people who were not free and had no chance for freedom. Of course, it is not human nature to want to be enslaved. Slavery, as it was practiced in America, had a dehumanizing effect, leaving the slaves with no hope for a better life. Slaves had started to revolt and plan conspiracies even before the beginning of the American Revolution. The slaveholders greatly feared the uprising of their slaves, and their fears were confirmed in 1791 with the Haitian Revolution.
The whites felt at that time that these people who were here, these free black people, remaining here would be threatening to their society and their economy. So it would be good to get rid of them. And those who were still holding slaves felt if those free people remain here, they will still bring up about some disturbance.
White Americans feared a massive slave uprising similar to the Haitian Revolution and were intimidated by free blacks becoming an integral part of the country's economy. The question was, what to do about it? Thomas Jefferson, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, and a slave owner himself, wrote that all men are created equal. But the language was not meant to be inclusive and therefore was never applied to blacks, including free blacks. Full and equal citizenship would never occur under the government of his time. When Thomas Jefferson was a member of the General Assembly, he could not envision an integrated society in which free blacks were American citizens. He made a proposal to Congress for the emancipation and colonization of free blacks from the state of Virginia. The terms of the bill provided for the acquisition of territory elsewhere in the world for the gradual colonization of free blacks in a land of their own.
The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, the most degrading submission on the other. I tremble for my country when I think that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. The blacks may assert their freedom. The Almighty has no attribute which can take sides with us in such a contest.
Although Jefferson had a strong argument, Congress rejected the idea. Meanwhile, there was a growing movement to abolish slavery.
And simply put, it was a moral force they thought they would bring to bear within the body politics to persuade their fellow Americans that it was immoral, it was ungodly to hold people in slavery. The thing to do was to abolish slavery and grant to these people their full citizenship.
By 1807, Congress had not abolished slavery, but had outlawed the trading of slaves by voting to ban their importation. Instead of the slave trade coming to a close, it flourished as traders continued illegally importing slaves through North Carolina for use in the southern agricultural states. You see, Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin 10 years earlier, which had made the cotton crop very profitable. So the plantation owners needed even more slaves to keep up with the demand. Despite the increase in demand for slaves, the idea of colonization had not died. Jefferson, now president, contacted the British to secure their consent to send free blacks from America to Sierra Leone, the country established by the British for the repatriation of their freed slaves. Again, he was denied. It was a wealthy free black shipping merchant by the name of Cuffy, a strong proponent of colonization, who secured the immigration of free blacks to that West African country. In 1811, he sailed to Sierra Leone and founded the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone for the purpose of sending free blacks to that country. The War of 1812 further deferred the colonization of free blacks, but Paul Cuffe would not let the dream die. In 1815, he transported 38 free blacks from Massachusetts to Sierra Leone at his own expense, a sum of $4,000. To some of us, that's a lot of money even now. So imagine the significance of his investment then. In 1817, Paul Cuffe died before his dream was fully realized. But his success was a turning point in efforts for colonization. Another strong proponent of the cause, Reverend Robert Finley, saw colonization as an opportunity for charitable work, a chance to bring Christianity to Africa. In time, the former slaves who went to Africa would carry out this mission.
The thinking of that period among Westerners, which they were, clearly was no different from that of other white Americans. So part of their mission for going to Africa was, of course, to Christianize and civilize the savage Africans.
Many free blacks, devout Christians, wanted to return to the homeland of their forefathers, but they were unable to solicit support on their own behalf because they couldn't vote and had little chance for political or educational opportunities. They were less than whites, in a sense non-citizens in this white elitist society, despite the fact that they were theoretically free. So, a growing number wanted to emigrate to Africa, but other free blacks wanted to stay in America and fight for the abolishment of slavery. At that time, the abolishment of slavery seemed unlikely, since there was still a continuous flow of slaves being imported into America illegally. But the population of free blacks was also still growing, and what to do about that remained a topic of great concern. Reverend Finley traveled to Washington, D.C. to win the support of the government. While there, he won the support of his brother-in-law, Elias Caldwell, clerk of the Supreme Court, and his friend, Francis Scott Key. Together, the three canvassed citizens, churches, and other organizations to gain support for their plan. They formed the American Society for the Colonization of Free People of Color, later known as the American Colonization Society. The ACS was one of the most distinguished group of citizens ever assembled in any organization in American history.
When the American Colonization Society was formed in December of 1816, all of its leaders were white, many of them slaveholders who did not want a free black population in the United States. They felt that the free black population belied slavery, that if you had a slave here and you said blacks were only capable of slavery, and then you had a rich seaman, black man like Paul Cuffe owning ships and traveling up and down the coast, how are you going to continue to claim that blacks are only able to be slaves?
The ACS had yet to win the support of Congress or President James Monroe. However, by 1819, the Slave Trade Act was passed, appropriating funds to send a U.S. naval squadron to apprehend slave traders off the coast of Africa and return their human cargo to their homeland. Since there was no African land claimed by America, there's no port to return them to. The American Colonization Society recognized this event as their opportunity to colonize free blacks in a territory elsewhere in the world. The ACS made their move and approached Congress for federal funding to colonize in Africa. Again, they were turned down. They approached President Monroe directly, certain that there must be some way for this to happen. President Monroe decided to create an African agency, appointing a government agent and providing transportation for the agent, free blacks, and supplies to go to Africa to set up a colony for the return of Africans from the slave ships. The ACS was financially responsible for purchasing land and setting up a safe colony.
They were leaving a culture into which they had been born, bred, and were going to Africa where they had never been before. They were faced with a situation which, in their own minds, was inferior.
Get there before I do.
In 1820, the ACS chartered a small merchant ship, the Elizabeth, which set sail from a New York harbor and docked 6 weeks later at Freetown, Sierra Leone. Paul Cuffey's former business partner, John Cazell, had purchased a tract of land on Sherbro Island and set up a temporary settlement for the colonists there. Unfortunately, the settlement was built on low, marshy land surrounded by dense thickets, and adequate drinking water was not accessible. The colonists couldn't survive in these conditions and began to die off one by one. The surviving settlers returned to Sierra Leone to escape the certain death of Sherbro Island. Their dream of a true home and the freedom they had long been denied was in jeopardy. Since Sherbro Island had proven unsuitable for habitation and so many settlers had died, priorities shifted and land for a permanent settlement had not been purchased. By 1821, the surviving settlers asked the ACS for help in purchasing land, and in response, the Society dispatched Representative Dr. Eli Ayres to purchase land south of Sierra Leone. With the aid of Captain Robert F. Stockton, Ayres cruised the coastal waters of what is now Grand-Bassau, seeking appropriate land for the colony. Evidently, Captain Stockton was an aggressive negotiator as well as navigator, for in a series of incidents that ended with him holding his gun to King Peter's head, a treaty was signed that ceded the land from the indigenous tribes to the colonists.
This land was communal land. The people did not understand that when they sold land to the settlers, that it was theirs, and they had no more jurisdiction over these parcels of land.
Of course, an agreement signed at gunpoint by someone who neither reads, writes, nor believes in the ownership of land doesn't mean much. So the Dey, Gola, and Vai tribes formed an alliance and attempted to forcibly evict the settlers. So began the unrest in this land that would soon become Liberia.
I'm certain that if I had been a chief or paramount chief or whatever and saw these people come with their pots and pans and spoons and tobacco and liquor and try to buy land, which was something absolutely foreign to their culture, I would have thought exactly as they did, well, which has been recorded. They bought the land, they drank the alcohol, smoked the tobacco, used the food and the utensils, and said, "How y'all think we're stupid? This land cannot be bought," and so they fought over the land.
In the next year, the survivors of Sherbro Island arrived in Cape Messerado, the land purchased from King Peter. The new settlers began to clear the land to build their colony. Predictably, further warring between the indigenous ethnic groups and the settlers ensued.
The settlers came into an area where there were several communities, each with its own agenda, and more often than not, these agendas generated conflict. And the settlers' presence in the midst of this conflict by itself generated conflict.
After all, the tribal kings ruled this land, and in their minds, land can never be owned by anyone.
The king in Africa was the prime servant, because the true African society was the pure socialist society. The king was the custodian for his people. He was the representative of his people. When there was war, he went ahead of his army. He defended his people. And he was the custodian of the wealth of his people, of the land. It didn't belong to him, but it didn't belong to them. He was the one who dispersed of it.
The American Colonization Society sent agent Jehudi Ashman, who prepared the colony for defense against the tribes opposed to the settlement. The colonists enclosed the town with pickets and mounted cannons to protect themselves from tribal attacks. A military was formed and officers appointed.
What could a number of spears and arrows do to a cannon? So even though our greater numbers could have pretty much eliminated the American Liberians, their superior military power and organization clearly made a difference.
The colonists prevailed, and by 1824 created a plan for government and drafted a constitution resembling that of America. They presented the plan to the American Colonization Society, who agreed to the Constitution and the name Liberia, which was proposed by General Robert Goodloe Harper.
Mr. President, I will call the attention of the society to a matter of some, though not perhaps a very great moment. It is to the proposition for giving a name to our African colony. Names are at all times matters of convenience and sometimes of advantage. Our colony has at present no name. It is situated indeed near a cape called Mesurado, and has hitherto taken its name and designation from this circumstance. I have thought of a name that is peculiar, short, and familiar, and that expresses the object and nature of the establishment. It is the term Liberia, and denotes a settlement of persons made free, for our colony may with truth be called the home and country of freed men, in contradistinction to those slaves of whom they once formed a part. This name, if I mistake not, will be found easy and apt, and it certainly has the merit of being very concise.
Their dream was to found a nation somewhere where they could live in peace, develop, become a nation, prove to the rest of the world that yes, we were slaves, but we were capable of governing ourselves.
The concept of democracy was foreign to the indigenous people, who were ruled by the kings. How could the settlers have any authority over the kings? This crystallized the cultural clash that had already been established between the settlers and the indigenous people, based on the superiority that the settlers felt over the tribal rulers of the land.
That attitude of some cultural superiority may have laid some of the foundation. And certainly on the side of the natives, I'm sure they felt themselves, of course, superior to these aliens coming from America who had been slaves. Because slaves hold what? Very low status in most communities, including African communities, because slavery was not alien to Africa.
The commercial slave trade of the indigenous people was endangered by the mere presence of the settlers. After all, the settlers were free black slaves from America, and they certainly didn't want the sale of slaves, customary or not, happening in their midst.
You had powerful men like King Peter, who dominated the whole northeastern area of what was to become Monrovia. And in that area you've got the St. Paul River. Now this was his terminus through which he passed his merchandise to his overseas collaborators or customers. And then at the north, at the southeast end of what is now Liberia, you're talking about Grand Bassa, you had powerful men like Bob Gray, who controlled the slave market down there. And these men had regular customers who were British nationals, Portuguese nationals, Spanish nationals, and even Cuban nationals. So this was a commercial livelihood that provided the wherewithal that made these men very powerful. And suddenly it was going to be a clash between their commercial interests and the philosophical concern that brought these settlers all the way across the ocean to a strange continent.
One of the largest slave factories was located at Traytown in King West's territory. African kings from the interior of the country supplied the slaves. Agent Ashman was determined to wipe out slavery, and he called upon the American Navy to help him. As they arrived, an intense war raged with the Africans on one side and the American Navy and the colonists on the other. Cannons, muskets, and spears flew through the air until there was a great explosion. Once the smoke cleared, they could see a fire burning in a nearby village had reached an arsenal, and the slave factory was destroyed. This one event contributed more to the suppression of the slave trade than did any other single event in Liberia's history.
There was a real resentment on the part of the indigenous groups to this group coming in, disrupting slave trade, disrupting other trades, trying to get involved in the trading and to get involved in the economy in general.
Meanwhile, the settlers had begun to establish foreign trade of native crops in order to create revenue for their settlement and look toward independence from the American Colonization Society. Long before the settlers came, though, the indigenous people were harvesting and trading camwood, palm oil, and Malaguita pepper. These are indigenous crops. In fact, that's why early European traders called our coast the Grain Coast. Wherever the Malaguita grew, the Pepperbird could be heard. And that's why the Pepperbird represents our country. Ship after ship of immigrants from America arrived, and slave ships apprehended off the coast of Africa by the American Navy brought more and more people to Liberia. These captured Africans returned by the American ships were known as Congas. The Congas were instrumental in helping the colonists defend themselves against the natives, build their colony, farm the land, and harvest native crops for export. Back in America, applications for returning to Africa were flooding the American Colonization Society. But the ACS had no federal funds to charter ships, so they turned to individual state legislatures asking that they establish chapters to help raise money for the cause. The ACS began to sell lifetime memberships in order to help raise funds. It wasn't long before 2 states withdrew their support from the ACS and instead sought to purchase their own land near Liberia. Both the Maryland and the Mississippi State Colonization Societies established colonies on the west coast of Africa toward the southern part of Liberia, independent of the American Colonization Society. With Liberia's slave trade nearly abolished and its population growing, the colony began to expand its boundaries. Through a series of treaties with African kings, the Americo-Liberians had acquired a significant amount of land through purchases and conquests. Despite these signed treaties, conflicts raged between the colonists and indigenous people to establish authority over the land.
So what you had was somewhat of a mutual ethnocentrism on both sides, each side considering its way of doing things superior. And when you have that, of course, the group with the better military organization and power can actualize its claims. And they had a greater military power and were able to impose their values on the rest of society.
Americo-Liberians acted somewhat like European colonizers. They remained separate from the indigenous people, controlling political power, educational opportunities, and seeking to convert indigenous people to Christianity.
When the settlers came, unfortunately, they did not take time out to get to know the African, to get to know his culture, his tradition, his way of thinking. They wanted to impose their way of life on the African, their religion, their education, everything.
Some of them could read and write, many of them could not. And they considered the fact that they could read the Bible and that these indigenous people could not. They considered the fact that their slave masters wore top hats, tailcoats, and other kinds of Western dress, something to be proud of. And they believed that it was their mission, and in some cases, God-given mission, to acculturize these people that they found there.
By 1840, the settlers, frustrated by a lack of financial support from the ACS, began to talk about becoming an independent nation. Though the American government helped us to colonize, they had no intention of claiming us as a part of their country, so we had to make it on our own. The problem was, many of the world powers didn't see Liberia as a sovereign nation. And we faced many political threats, chiefly Britain, who wanted to claim part of our land as their own. The dilemma was multiplied by their inability to collect customs from ships that traded in their port. This confirmed the need to become an independent nation. In 1841, Liberia proclaimed self-governance. In 1847, the settlers elected their first president, Joseph Jenkins Roberts. The indigenous people, for the most part, were not integrated into the society and didn't vote. The elections did, however, establish the foundation of democracy, and President Roberts proclaimed his undying devotion to leadership of the new government.
The free people of color in the United States, wearied with beating the air to advance themselves to equal immunities with the whites in that country, and tired of the oppression which weighs them down there, are seriously turning their attention to Liberia as the only asylum they can flee to and be happy. The American Colonization Society has redeemed its pledge. And I believe in my soul that the permanency of the government of the Republic of Liberia is now fixed upon as firm a basis as human wisdom is capable of devising.
The government was further established with the Constitutional Convention held at the capital city of Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. Each representative signed the Declaration of Independence and approved the Constitution. While the young democracy was forming, the indigenous population was expected to adapt to the Western culture established by the settlers.
We, the natives, had to assimilate into Americo-Liberian culture for the most part. We had to learn English. We had to become Christians. We had to adapt to the kinds of foods, or at least the method of cooking of the food of the Americo-Liberians. We had to dress like the Americo-Liberians. We had to develop a marriage pattern like the Americo-Liberians, that is monogamy. So it was not much of a two-way street.
By 1885, Liberia had established its final borders. Through even more treaties signed by African kings, they had acquired some 350 miles of the African coast and had begun to push into the interior of this country. Even with all this land and natural resources, the Liberian government still wasn't financially stable. Foreign loan negotiations took place in 1906 and again in 1912. A lien was placed on all revenue collected by the Liberian government, diverting all income towards the repayment of those loans. This was called a receivership. The outbreak of World War I interrupted trade and commerce, so the repayment of those loans was postponed. The settlers, desperate to generate revenue to repay these loans, began to divert trade from the powerful coastal tribe, the Crew. The Crew had long resisted Monrovia's authority and rose in rebellion, declaring loyalty to Great Britain and demanding annexation by Sierra Leone. The Americo-Liberians appealed to America for help, and the USS Chester was diverted to Africa to help stop the civil unrest. Determined to build their country and safeguard their sovereignty, Liberia became a founding member of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, their financial difficulties were far from over. In 1926, the government entered into a 99-year lease with Firestone on 1 million acres of land as a part of an agreement guaranteeing both the rubber and the labor needed for a long and profitable stay. This agreement resulted in an unprecedented level of influence of a commercial entity in the affairs of a sovereign nation. Firestone strengthened their hand in the deal with a $5 million loan to the Liberian government. Before the end of the decade, an extremely damaging and controversial issue arose. The Liberian government was accused of enslaving the indigenous people to work as a labor force. The League of Nations initiated an inquiry through an investigative committee. Although the investigative committee found no evidence to convict Liberia of such a crime as slavery, they did confirm forced labor profiteering. It is said that indigenous young men, younger than me, were coerced by certain high-level officials of the Liberian government to serve as laborers in the domestic market and for export to Fernando Po.
At that time, in Fernando Po, the Spaniards were growing cocoa. And then they appealed to Liberia for labor. We were told, I was told, and the people of our crowd, be careful how you walk on the road. The people are looking for little boys. They catch them, they put them in bags or hampers, and they send them to Fernando Po.
The scandal uncovered by the investigating committee wreaked irreparable damage on Liberia's image. After all, the founding fathers of this black nation were freed slaves, and they had now been found guilty of forced labor profiteering, which is just short of saying selling and subjugating of other blacks into slavery. This single event, unfortunately, became a dominant worldview, a stigma for Liberians of settler ancestry. By 1930, both Liberian President C.D.B. King and his vice president resigned as a result of this scandal before the legislature could impeach them. Secretary of State Edwin Barclay was appointed president. He was faced with the challenge of healing the internal wounds of the country and gaining respect for the people. He worked in accordance with the recommendations of the League of Nations to create an economy without the use of forced labor. The work to rebuild the nation continued when President William V.S. Tubman was elected to office in 1944. He began his presidency with only a small amount of revenue.
Liberians were farmers. They were basically a farming people. Money was almost non-existent. When my father became president in 1944, for the first time we had a budget of $1 billion. President Barclay had raised the revenues to $1 million during his last term, his last year in office in 1943. But the first budget of $1 million was when my father became president. Now think about running a country on less than $1 million for so long. These were some of the difficulties that the earlier people faced.
President Tubman worked to build the country. By implementing a unification policy, he removed some of the barriers that divided our people.
For we, as a developing country, cannot content ourselves only with the passive consumption of the centuries of educational thoughts and findings of other nations. The time has come for us to rationally examine and assess the full value of our national flag, our folklores and folkways, and conduct investigations into the meaning and significance of our freedom.
He was instrumental in implementing the open door policy in accordance with the League of Nations recommendations. The open door policy brought in hundreds of millions of dollars from foreign investors and companies who began to enthusiastically invest in the abundant mining industry and capitalize on our other natural resources. Government revenues soared in both trade and commerce, and as a result, more roads, schools, and hospitals were built. The revenues also provided scholarships for students to study abroad. This is what allowed me to study in America.
With the open door policy, monies came in and we began to give scholarships to people from all over the country, every tribe, every region.
As indigenous Liberian people became educated, we came to understand serious divisions within the society between ourselves and the dominant Americo-Liberians.
Tubman was a charismatic man and a ferocious administrator. He was absolute head of his political system, which some felt ignored segments of the population with opposing political ideologies. Tubman remained president for 26 years until his death in 1971, when William Richard Tolbert, who had served as a loyal vice president for 19 years, was sworn into office. But yet another pot was brewing because of the students returning home from studying abroad.
As these students returned home, they brought with them the new ideas, the ideas of the post-World War II, the ideas of the nuclear age, and they began to demand changes in these agreements. A commission was set up to study these things, and the implementation began within the first 4 years of President Tolbert's administration, and it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
The Tolbert administration was known for its business-like manner and was much more tolerant of the opposing political forces than the Tubman administration had been.
on so many occasions, he entertained discussions with these people. Not only did he entertain discussions, but he also supported their endeavors. He's also supported, when I say supported, he allowed them to freely, roam the whole country, to seek out people and foster their own programs. There was freedom of speech. They actively were involved in the whole democratic process within the country.
The voices of opposing political parties grew loud, and the ethnic division between the Americo-Liberians and the indigenous people took a turn in 1979 with what was known as the Rice Riots. You see, rice is the staple food of my people, but we could not grow enough to feed everyone. So the government would import it from other countries. The demand grew along with the increase in population, and since the price of importation grew along with the demand, the government raised the price of rice. On April 12, 1979, the people, incited by political activists, rioted in protest. 40 people were killed, and many were wounded. Tolbert's administration could not stop the momentum. Change was brewing, and protest was reeling out of control. On April 14, 1980, a master sergeant in the Liberian army and a member of the Kron ethnic group assassinated President William Tolbert and took over the government.
President Tolbert, the president of Liberia at the time, who in fact was murdered in a bloody military takeover, was also the head of the Organization of African Unity. He was a president who at the time made some decisions strategic for Liberia, which in fact did not sit too well with Liberia's historical partners, international partners.
Tolbert was slain in the executive mansion along with many others. Another 13 government officials were executed in a graphic public display on South Beach.
I look back at my father's contributions to Liberia. I look back and see the development process. I look back and see change in Liberia for the good of the people, for the good of the country. I look back and I see all of these people that were killed in 1980, that were put on the firing squad, publicly executed. I look at their contributions to this country. And what were they charged for? Treason, misuse of public funds, misuse of their offices, their governmental offices, to perpetuate their own aims. I see that they're being killed for their contributions to their country and mankind.
This violent takeover was welcomed by many as a significant shift favoring the majority of the population formerly excluded from power.
It's certainly wrong to say that the Africans were always so oppressed that they were not able to exert any power. They certainly were able to influence from the beginning to this hour a balance of power in that country, and they always had to be reckoned with, always. So that I think sometimes when people are assessing the situation, they kind of miss the point that there was power on both sides of the struggle, but that the settlers always were able to maintain the technological superiority. Again, simply meaning they had more guns.
Despite the fact that Doe's rise to power made many Liberians more hopeful, he was accused of inflicting massive human rights violations on the Liberian people and ruining the economy. As if this wasn't enough, in 1985, Doe reportedly stole the general elections and declared himself president. In 1989, an opposition faction led by Charles Taylor sparked the Civil War, taking up arms against the Doe regime. More and more breakaway military groups began to form throughout the country to fight for political power and control of the country's resources.
This Civil War started maybe 100 years ago, but it did not erupt until lately. And it's the culmination of denial. Okay, the indigenous person was not given certain positions. He didn't have access to certain privileges. And when the coup happened in 1980, it was the first time that the indigenous person on a large scale was given the opportunity to do certain things, to rule the government.
In 1990, President Doe was captured and assassinated by yet another warring faction. The killing spree that followed commenced the 7 years of civil war.
The coup was a sorrowful incident, but it just had to happen. Something had to happen to bring in a change. For 133 years, we call them immigrants or the Americans or the settlers, they had deprived the indigenous people from a political and every kind of aspect of the country.
The Economic Community of West African States, the United Nations, and other international peacekeeping forces worked toward bringing the Civil War to an end, but the fabric of our nation was violently ripped apart. We needed unity as a Liberian people, but instead we had warlords and their factions espoused by their own agendas and ambitions. The interim and transitional governments, all of which held power since the assassination of President Doe, failed to bring about a lasting peace. During the war, over 150,000 Liberians were killed, hundreds of thousands were injured, and 1.5 million of us fled our homes and took refuge in foreign countries or makeshift camps.
So I am hoping that the terrors of the recent Civil War and the terrible memory of the coup will be enough for all factions involved to decide that unless everybody works together to build the Liberian nation, there won't be a Liberian nation.
At the end of this brutal civil war, many are still bitter. It is difficult to blame, and it's difficult not to blame. But perhaps it would be better if we focused on issues that would bring about a lasting peace in Liberia. In August 1997, Charles Taylor, head of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, was democratically elected president.
The Liberian dream has not failed. It was deferred for a while, but we are again putting it back on track. And that dream was to continue to build a political system second to none, and to demonstrate for all time to the critics, the racist critics of the African, that the African was capable of building a modern state and conducting his own affairs.
Liberia was once the beacon for black freedom and independence on the African continent. Let us not look to the outside world. Let us turn inward to resolve our own conflict. Otherwise, our forefathers' dream will die. And the search for liberty that brought us here will end in us denying freedom to one another. Let us not be divided by talks of tribe or class. Let the blood of our brothers and sisters that cries out to God, let it cry peace instead of vengeance.
50%.
50%.
50%. Did you know that if you're between the ages of 18 and 35, you're 10 times more likely to die from a car crash?
Increase your odds by 50%.
Just by wearing a seatbelt.
It can make the difference between living or dying.
I know this.
We know this.
Do you?
So click it, red ticket. In Rhode Island, it's the law. Seatbelts save lives.
Liberia! Ha! It's your day! It's time to party! This is real fight! Doing it for y'all! I am proud to be a Liberian, and I don't care what anybody go say. I will jump and sing and shout hooray, 'cause today is our Independence Day. Liberia, Liberia, we are free. Liberia, number one. Liberia, Liberia, our day. Liberia, we are free. 'Cause today is our day. Liberia, now my country, now my motherland, land.